So as we reflect on Youth Day, we'll look at the current state of education funding in South Africa and how can the national budget be leveraged as a tool to advance equality and improve educational outcomes for all learners. So let's take a look now at where things stand currently, given what the President also had to speak about, taking a step back into the past. We speak to budget analyst at Section 27 and member of the Budget Justice Coalition, Matshidiso Lencoasa. Matshidiso, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming in. Let's begin first with, something that the President speaks about, key moments in our democracy. He talks about the youth of 1976, but also speaking about post-democracy. You then had fees must fall, for example, and that put the focus sharply on education and funding in the country. And I wonder, when you look back at the road that has been traveled between then and now, have we made moves?
Firstly, thank you so much for the opportunity and a really important question on this Youth Day, because, as someone who was part of the Fees Must Fall movement, we had the exuberance of youth and, just fighting for what was right and getting the inspiration from the previous generation to fight for it, because that was our site of struggle. But I think that we've seen, 10 years later, more than 10 years later, that we are still fighting and there's still a struggle. It just has manifested at the economy. So we have, for example, these interventions, for example, education and higher education as well, that are supposed to overcome barriers for access that people literally put their lives on the line for. But we have those interventions, but the funding doesn't align with that. So our economy is not oriented towards improving the lives of young people. We know that unemployment, inequality and poverty, it is young people in our generation who are most represented in that. Unemployment statistics, youth unemployment is incredibly high, and really the message that our economy and economic policy is saying is that for young people, young black women in particular, were unemployable. And I think there's a mismatch, and there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done so that we can also celebrate and commemorate Youth Day in its entirety.
From the work you've done, what seems to be the bottlenecks here? Where are the problems?
Yeah, so I mean, my perspective as a budget analyst, I will always say the economy, because we have these, like I mentioned, these wonderful interventions, but they are set up to fail because, as they always say, there is no money, there is no funding, but the story stops there. We don't see our industrial policy, our trade policy, our fiscal policy that's saying, how do we generate more money so that our economy can serve the people, serve its people? How do we create employment, for instance? And so I think that our bottleneck is the funding allocation, that it just seems that there's not investment enough in our generation and in young people, first of all, but then to extend it also, of that little investment, not every single rand doesn't actually go towards advancing and improving the quality of lives for all young people in our country. And so we just end up having an economy, a budget, fiscal policy, economic policies that entrench the inequalities that the class of 76 were actively fighting against. And unfortunately, it seems that there is no political will to prioritize the ordinary South African, the day-to-day person, and rather it is oriented towards foreign markets and making sure that on paper our balance sheet looks good. But just because our balance sheet looks good doesn't mean that the lives of our people are actually materially improved.
Matshidiso, you speak about the youth of 1976. Part of what the fight was about is against exclusion, right? And I take a step back to look at what Stats SA had to say in February this year, for example, that while most learners in South Africa are able to access education, particularly at basic education level, a new report by Stats SA highlights those who remain excluded from the education they aspire to, largely due to cost pressures. And it speaks to the inequalities of the system. And if inequalities continue to persist in this manner, we're still going to see what becomes the expansion of the haves and the have-nots. And that has serious ramifications for the economy.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, because, yes, we're commemorating, for example, the struggle of the class of 1976, but if we don't fix our economy, we just continue to exacerbate those inequalities or reproduce the inequalities that we thought were being fought against. And I think that, especially for our generation, maybe that is a call for us, to really be able to be held accountable. Because right now, for example, we do have the privilege or are able to question the previous generation of what were you guys fighting for, what has actually happened. But I don't know if we can then say to the next generation what we were able to do with it. And so I think that if we don't take seriously the sites of struggle, this economy that is reproducing inequality, that is setting us up to fail by the time we even get into the labor market to overcome the cycle of poverty. We're already at a disadvantage if we don't prioritize and push for a parliament and a government and leadership that prioritizes that. Unfortunately, we'll have very little to say when the next generation holds us to account.
How do you do that in a country where at times we hear young people who say, in fact, we're not at the table? So we don't even feel like we are part of what is being talked about. I know the president today speaks about MPs that are in parliament, speaks about a number of young people that are in leadership positions, but look at the fraction of that versus a lot of the young people in the country. So how do you begin to make sure that you are holding yourselves to account, but also at the same time you participate meaningfully in some of these conversations?
Yeah, so I think for us, we really can't wait for perfect conditions to effect change. We can learn that from previous generations as well, who had less, at their disposal and didn't have the tools that we've inherited. I don't think we should wait for a leadership position. We should wait to be recognized in parliament. I think that we should look at what we have at our disposal, where we are. So, for instance, I'm in the NGO sector, civil society sector, but we find young people all over in media, in politics, in all of it. And I think we need to see the work that we're doing, not just to survive or barely keep up, but to start to think about our generational story and what are we going to tell the next generation. So I think that it is easy to get bogged down and say, well, they're not creating opportunities for us. And it sounds like there is no political will to do that. But if we continue and leave that as the status quo, then we'll continue to just reproduce and we won't be able to say, at least we tried. Maybe we failed, but at least we tried. And so I do think that it's just really important for us to take it very seriously, to not worry about the packaging that, I know there's a lot of narrative around, us being unemployable, for example. There's always just a hoop and and the next layer of, okay, you don't have a degree. Okay, fine. You don't have an honors. Okay, you don't have this. But I think that we have so much to offer as a generation, and we see it all the time. I think we just need to consolidate that, those efforts and be serious, and also make sure that our efforts are not being hijacked, because a lot of causes do end up veering off in a different direction. I don't know if the class of 76 is impressed at the state of education, for instance, of today. And so I think that we also need to be cognizant around and have a strong generational mission, know that we cannot wait for change, because that change isn't going to come the more we keep waiting, but to actually actively come together, organize and build and fight for an economy that really works for young people in our country.
Do you feel that post-2015, fees must fall, there was a veering off from the mission?
Well, absolutely. And I think it's one of the the controversial discourse that happens amongst us as fallers, especially people who didn't hold more prominent positions. I think a lot of people, I speak for myself as well, we took a lot of scars. We have a lot of scars from that, and we made a lot of sacrifices. And so to see a lot of the gains that have been made, the progress being eroded, we do question a lot of that. It is also disappointing to see sometimes when we have issues like, for example, we have interventions like NSFAS or some kind of higher education interventions or education interventions, but then the people who we are asking to represent us in parliament or politics are not actively calling for greater funding towards that. It does feel that they're not using the platform the way that we would like to, but I think that in that, it is a lesson for us, is that even within ourselves, we can't wait for certain people to lead us. I think the leadership actually has to come from us. If not, then we'll just continue to say the same old story, the same economy, South Africa, that isn't working for all people, the same disappointing story globally, that we have some of the highest inequalities in the world, and we can actually change that, but it also requires a certain will from us. Yesterday, I was at Youth Parliament yesterday, so Parliament was hosting a special event, and just the number of young people who rose up and said they actually want to run as councillors. They want to take matters into their own hands because we're being failed. Even the little representation that we have, it's being set up to fail. And so I take inspiration from that, and I take inspiration from the young people that I'm constantly engaging. But I think that it's going to take more than just the words and the fancy words, but we actually have to take action and be serious about building a country that we can pass on to the next generation.
And we had a conversation yesterday about the Youth Parliament, and we're continuing today. So thank you so much for those reflections. Appreciate your time as always. That is Section 27. In fact, that is Matshidiso Lencoasa, the budget analyst at Section 27 and member of the Budget Justice Coalition, speaking to us about her own reflections as far as the road of education funding is concerned in South Africa.